we open up the floor for discussion. So we're hoping to spend about an hour, maybe a little less, sharing presentations, so talking until about 11, and then the rest of the 30 minutes we're just going to leave open for you all to ask questions and talk to some of the experts. And if you would like to hear more about Living Shorelines and you want more information on how to build one on your property specifically, you can also include your email, phone number, and property address in the chat box, but you can send this to us privately in one of the messages to myself or one of the other hosts. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for coming. This meeting is really geared toward waterfront property owners who are looking to learn about living shorelines, and we wanted to just link them up with some people who can help them get started. So we're going to be given a very basic overview of what living shorelines are without too much technical information. And with us today, you'll hear from myself. I'm Rachel Bassesi with the North Carolina Coastal Federation, as well as Dr. Alexia Weaver, who is our central office manager and coastal scientist. And then we have two representatives from Restoration Systems, Margaret McKinney, who's the Director of Coastal Restoration, and Granger Cautry, who's the Project Assistant. I want to make sure I said their names right. Okay. So a little background on the Federation. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1982. We do different projects to help keep the North Carolina coast clean and healthy. And we have about 30 staff members and 30 board members that govern the work that we do. We have 3 offices that are spread out along the North Carolina coast, and our work covers the 20 coastal counties in North Carolina. Our 5 main goals focus on promoting living shorelines, which you're going to learn all about today, restoring oyster habitat, protecting water quality, reducing marine debris, and effective coastal management. Okay, so do some of these photos look familiar to any of you? Hopefully not along your waterfront, but some of you are likely experiencing shoreline erosion, which is a natural occurrence, but has increased in the last few years due to increased frequency of tropical storms and hurricanes, sea level rise, as well as human disturbances such as boat wakes. So for our discussion today on living shorelines, we're going to be referring to erosion along soundside properties and estuarine creeks and rivers as opposed to oceanfront properties. Traditionally, the approach has been to control this erosion with expensive bulkheads or riprap. However, this hardening of the shoreline has led to the loss of valuable marsh habitat and oyster habitat. So what happens is that when waves from boat wakes or other storms come in and hit a bulkhead, that wave energy doesn't have anywhere to go. So instead, as the waves recede back into the sound, the energy goes back with it, and this process takes the sand in front of the bulkhead with it and causes what we refer to as scouring. So oftentimes, any marsh habitat or sand that was protecting the shoreline in front of that structure is slowly lost through time. However, when waves approach a living shoreline, the energy is not blocked. It goes through the rocks or oyster reef and then is absorbed through the salt marsh grass, and the energy can be dissipated. So in addition to this, as the tide comes in over a living shoreline, the sediments in the water will fall to the bottom at high tide, and over time, sand and sediment build up landward of that offshore sill or structure, protecting the shoreline from erosion. And we call these methods living shorelines because they really work with nature and allow habitat for plants and animals to live. And this picture right here at the top is from a bulkhead at Hammocks Beach State Park in Swansboro that was replaced with a living shoreline right beneath it in 2001. which consisted of an offshore rock fill, and then they came back in and filled with sand and then planted salt marsh grasses on top of that. So in addition to the loss of habitat in front of hard structures like bulkheads, the areas landward of the bulkheads also often get compromised and require repair or total replacement. So these photos are actually from Camp Albemarle in Carteret County, North Carolina, after Hurricane Florence. So you can see that their bulkhead suffered significant damage landward of the structure. And this is because bulkheads have been shown not to respond as well to living shorelines during storms. This image on the left is a study done by Dr. Rachel Gitman, where she looked at the response of bulkheads and living shorelines to the passage of Category 1 Hurricane Irene in 2011, and found that living shorelines were more effective at protecting the shore from erosion than bulkheads. So these photos on the right are from the study, and the bulkhead at the top is just 1,500 feet away from the living shoreline. So these are pictures 1 year before Hurricane Irene and then 1 day after Hurricane Irene. And you can see that the bulkhead experienced significant damage. It completely collapsed, while the living shoreline actually didn't suffer any erosion damage, which was confirmed by surface elevation measurements that they took. And this project was built by Mud Bucket Dredging, the contractors. And then, can y'all read that? Just kidding. I'm gonna give you an overview. So this is a study that was published in 2018 by Carter Smith and some other scientists with the UNC Institute of Marine Science, North Carolina Coastal Reserve, and East Carolina University. And they looked at bulkheads compared to living shorelines after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. And the results showed that the living shorelines actually exhibited better resistance to landward erosion during the hurricane than the bulkheads and natural marshes. And additionally, they found that living shorelines were more resilient than hardened structures like bulkheads. So these are a couple of photos from Camp Albemarle, which we just saw a few slides ago. The damage from their bulkhead. Right beside their bulkhead is a living shoreline, and this was actually a few days after Hurricane Florence. So looking back at the slides that had the bulkhead damage, right beside it, the living shoreline held up really nicely. And this is a living shoreline that was made using recycled oyster shells, which you'll learn about a little later. Same thing after Hurricane Florence. This is a living shoreline that is not too far away from Camp Albemarle in Carteret County. It's that in front of a private shoreline. And you can see in the picture on the left, they actually had significant damage to their dock from Hurricane Florence, but the living shoreline held up really nicely. So there's a few different types of living shorelines. Depending on the extent of erosion, they can consist of just planting salt marsh grasses alone if you're in an area that has low wave energy. If you have higher wave energy, the plantings are combined with offshore structures. So an offshore parallel structure called a sill. Uh-oh. Sorry, y'all. Go back. I got too fancy with the clicker. Okay. So an offshore structure that's parallel to the shoreline is called a sill, and it can be comprised of rocks, recycled oyster shells, or other innovative materials, such as those from Sandbar Oyster Company. And another living shoreline technique is called a marsh to revetment, which you see on this right side of the screen. We use this technique whenever there is a large escarpment along the edge of the marsh, and we place the recycled oyster shells right up against the edge of the marsh, kind of hugging the shoreline. This approach is best suited for areas where you have like cliffs right up against the marsh edge. Let's talk about planting first. So there are basically 3 marsh grass species that are planted here in North Carolina for our living shoreline. Sporobolus, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, Sporobolus alterniflorus, previously known as Spartina alterniflora, is the main species that we plant here for our living shorelines. They recently changed the taxonomy on it, and it's been throwing me off a little bit. I used to have a great joke about Spartina that I can't use anymore. Maybe I might share it with y'all. We'll see when I finish this slide. But smooth cordgrass is the common name, and that's the dominant species. It is planted below the high tide line, closer to the water, and then salt meadow hay and black needle rush, which are planted above the high tide line in the upper marsh. So I'm going to tell y'all the joke. I used to say that if you've ever seen that movie 300, where they have the warriors, the like Spartan warriors, and they yell, "This is Spartina, this is Sparta." I used to yell, "This is Spartina grass." So the salt marsh grasses are obtained from nurseries. A lot of times people ask if they can just harvest them from some other places, some other marshes. And the answer is actually no, they cannot be harvested from other places and transplanted because they are wetland plants in areas of environmental concern, and as such, they're protected and regulated by the Coastal Area Management Act. So you should order your plants in the fall around October, because that is when the smooth cordgrass put their seeds out. The growers will then go out and collect the seeds in the field and place them in a refrigerator until about February or so. And then they are planted in the soil in trays and grown in a greenhouse. They're usually ready for planting around April and May, which is when you want to put them in the ground to capture the growing season. If they are planted during other times of the year, the success rate is not quite as good. Sometimes the plugs are too tall and top heavy when they come from the nursery. So if that's the case, we like to give them what we call a haircut. You just literally use some yard clippers and trim the tops off so that when you plant them, they're standing up straight and not flopping over. And here are some nurseries in North Carolina that sell salt marsh plants. Garner's Landscaping sells them for $1 a plug, but they're delivering them. And then there's a few other ones. The range of cost is between 75 cents and $1, depending on if you're going to get them delivered or not. And we'll share this list with everybody as well. And then you might be thinking, well, how do you plant them? So at the Coastal Federation, we use a tool called a dibble bar, which is that orange tool that I'm using in the photo. And we usually dig a hole using the dibble bar about 6 inches deep and wide. And we generally plant them about 6 inches to 1 foot apart. So we found that planting the marsh grass plugs closer together, less than a foot apart, as opposed to the traditional method of planting them 2 feet apart, actually increases the success of the planting significantly. We like to say safety in numbers, and this photo down here in the corner shows a section of shoreline where the plants were planted very close together, and they actually grew taller and greener than any of the other ones that were planted. And this is a funny story as well. At the Federation, we work with a lot of community groups and volunteers and students, and I think we had some students from a 5th grade class come out to Hammocks Beach State Park to plant these marsh grasses. And we showed them how to plant everything. They knew what they were supposed to do, but we had this one group that they were kind of lazy. You know, they didn't want to get up and plant the plants in the spacing requirements that we had given them. And so you can see they literally just planted the tray directly in the ground, all right beside each other, but those plants did really, really well. And then these are just some before and after photos that we wanted to show you. These were taken at Jones Island in the White Oak River near Swansboro. And after a year, you can see that the marsh had established quite nicely. But to give you an idea of the reason why it did so well is because we planted 9,000 plugs along this 250 linear foot of shoreline. So the more plugs that you are able to plant, the quicker your marsh area will become established. But every shoreline is different. Some may take a bit longer, and this was actually on the other side of that same island. It took a little bit longer because it was a wider area and we had a greater area to cover. And so this was planted for multiple years with thousands of marsh grass plugs. And here are a few before and after photos of a planting behind an offshore sill that you can see in that first photo. That sill was built using bags of recycled oyster shells. And you just see how well the marsh has established after that planting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alexia Weaver, and she's going to share some more information with you all on the different types of living shoreline materials that you can use besides just planting. Thank you, everyone. We got a question in from the chat box. I believe this was at Carteret Community College in Morehead City.
All right, hi everyone. So as Rachel said, I'm Alexia Weaver. I'm at the Coastal Federation Central Regional Office in Ocean, and I work closely with Rachel here. Not too close because we have to be 6 feet apart now, right? So for the living shoreline marsh stills and marsh tow revetments, there are multiple materials that can be used. And I'm only going to show you just a few of the ones that are more commonly used here in the central region of the state. The Coastal Federation, as well as other groups in other states, we've really had incredibly great success using these mesh bags filled with recycled oyster shells to build living shorelines in low to moderate wave energy areas and in areas where oysters naturally grow. The oyster bags are basically placed parallel along the shoreline, and they slow down wave energy, thereby reducing erosion and restoring the valuable salt marsh habitat and the oyster habitat that has been lost through the years. So the bags they're volunteer friendly, they're not very heavy, and the shells inside the bags, they serve as a hard surface for new oysters to attach to and grow. And eventually the stills and the marsh tow revetments, as you see in the middle photo there, they turn into productive oyster reefs, and the bags themselves are no longer visible. The new oysters, they also help to improve water quality because as they feed, they filter the water. So each oyster shell can filter, each oyster, can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. This oyster reef, it serves as great habitat for stone crabs, mud crabs, hermit crabs, polychaetes, sea squirts, all sorts of intertidal estuarine life, mussels, clams, barnacles, and a variety of fish, and they quickly take residence in and around the bags. So living shorelines that are built with these oyster bags are inexpensive when compared to other shoreline stabilization methods, and they're attractive to property owners. They've also fared incredibly well to strong storms and hurricanes, as Rachel discussed, such as the recent passage of Hurricane Florence here that passed through North Carolina in 2018. These oyster bag living shorelines, they were not damaged by these storms or hurricanes. The bags stayed in place at the majority of these sites. There were a few sites where some of the bags rolled off, but they were easily placed back onto the sill of the marsh tow revetment by hand. Another option is to place these recycled oyster shells loosely along your shoreline. However, we do not recommend this, as the shells, they tend to scatter very quickly, and it just kind of reduces the erosion control of your shoreline. So where do we get the shells and the mesh? The recycled oyster shells are basically the shells of oysters that you all eat, that are harvested, and they're consumed by lots of people who like oysters. I don't like oysters, which is unfortunate living here in North Carolina. But each oyster has 2 shells, and once the inside is eaten, the leftover shells are recycled. They're put back into the water, not only as habitat for oysters, fish, and crabs, but they're also used to protect shorelines from erosion. These recycled oyster shells, they're purchased from seafood companies such as Quality Seafood Company in Elizabeth City at cost of about $3 per bushel plus transportation. We've gotten them in the past from some trucking companies that have delivered shells from other areas. You can also get oyster shells from large oyster rows that will donate them, from some local Rotary clubs, or they can be donated or purchased from restaurants as well. So to make the bags, we used the mesh that's a specifically designed bagging frame that's either made out of aluminum or wood, and these PVC tubes. The mesh bags, they come in rolls, and they're cut into 3 to 4 foot sections. The bags are tied at one end, and then they're placed onto these PVC tubes like a sock. The tubes are placed in the bagging frames, and then they're filled with the recycled oyster shells using shovels. And then once the tubes are removed, the filled bags are knotted on the other end, and then you get your oyster bags. So these are some photos of an oyster shell bag still living shoreline that were taken at Trinity Center in Pine Knoll Shores. This is what the site looked like before construction. And before restoration, a few months after restoration in April 2014, 1 year after restoration in May 2015, and then 4 years after restoration in September 2018. And you can see how the salt marsh area has been restored by having that protection afforded by the living shorelines. And the oyster shell bag sill, as you can see in this little inset here, was also covered in oysters. These are some other photos of this was a 700 linear foot oyster sill that was built by Bobby Cahoon Marine Construction in Indian Beach here in North Carolina. And you can see how the oysters gradually established themselves on the sill after year 1 and then 2 years after construction. So this oyster reef is great habitat, and the oysters growing on the sill are helping to filter the water in Bogue Sound, which is where this sill is located. So although these plastic bags, mesh bags, they work extremely well, we realize that it's not the best material to be putting in the water because it is plastic, right? But they do work. But we are partnering with several companies to develop potential alternatives to these traditional plastic mesh bags. The Coastal Federation, as well as many organizations, we've been trying to find a degradable mesh that lasts at least 3 to 5 years to allow the oysters to attach to and grow, and allow time for the reef and the shoreline to get established before the actual mesh bag degrades. So we're also looking into options for a stronger plastic mesh that would not be damaged if reefs are either affected by higher wave energies or if they're harvested. And these are a few of the companies that we are working with: Filtrex, Tensar, Green Recycling Solutions, and there's others as well. So living shorelines, they can also be built with Sandbar Oyster Companies. This is a North Carolina company. They're innovative oyster catcher materials, which basically consist of jute mesh that's rolled up and coated in concrete. And this serves as substrate for oysters to attach to. This is a living shoreline that was built at the North Carolina Aquarium at Pine Knoll Shores using the oyster catcher material. Oyster domes and reef balls are another type of living shoreline material. They're also concrete based, and these are also great artificial fish reef habitat as well. Other materials include oyster castles, which are also concrete based, and Atlantic Reef Maker has these Reef Maker ecosystem units, which are also concrete based, that can be used for living shoreline construction depending on the conditions of the site. So, and then finally, the last material we'll talk about is at higher wave energy areas. So rock sills are typically used, and they're either comprised of granite, concrete, or marl. After Hurricane Florence, we no longer recommend the marl, the limestone rock, because they have air pockets, and they were easily, the rocks were easily picked up and transported elsewhere with Hurricane Florence's storm surge. And then you can see in this bottom picture that the oysters also attached to this rock material. So these are photos of the shoreline in Pine Knoll Shores that Rachel showed you earlier before. And these are before and after construction. And you can see the erosion that was affecting the shoreline and how the sill and the plantings helped to restore that shoreline. And this living shoreline has survived multiple hurricanes and hasn't been needed to be repaired since it was installed. These are another set of before and after photos of that same shoreline on the other end of the property. So many factors are considered in the planning and the design of living shorelines. This includes wave energy, fetch, the predominant wind direction, the water depths at your site, the proximity to navigation channels, the orientation of the shoreline, the extent of the erosion slope, whether or not there's oysters at the site, the cost of the material, as well as property owner preference and what they like to see on their shoreline. So we have been incorporating the science that has been generated from many years of living shoreline research into our living shoreline designs in order to install them at the proper locations with respect to all of these factors and use the materials that are best suited for the environmental conditions at the site. In North Carolina, with the exception of salt marsh plantings alone, which do not require any permitting, living shoreline structures are required to obtain a Coastal Area Management Act, or CAMA permit from the state's Division of Coastal Management. And depending on your living shoreline design, either a CAMA general permit or a CAMA major permit is required. Your typical homeowner scale living shorelines that are less than 500 feet in length and no more than 30 feet from the high tide line qualify for a CAMA general permit. This permit is $200 and it involves providing a project location map, a simple diagram of the proposed living shoreline project, and then you have to notify or obtain signatures from your adjacent neighbors on either side, and this permit is valid for 120 days. However, it wasn't always this simple to obtain a permit for living shorelines. Before April 1st of 2019, it was kind of difficult, and it took a lengthy amount of time as it required review from a couple other state and federal agencies. So this was a major barrier for increasing the use of living shorelines over bulkheads, which have been always very easy to permit. But working with the regulatory agencies and our partners, as of April 1st of 2019, simple and small scale living shorelines can now be permitted in North Carolina just as easily as bulkheads through this amended general permit, which was a great breakthrough in living shoreline construction in North Carolina. So larger projects, those that don't meet the minimum conditions of the CAMA general permit, they require a CAMA major permit. And this permit costs a bit more at $400. The application form are on the Division of Coastal Management website. They require a bit more information about the project, a narrative, a copy of the deed, things like that. And this permit is reviewed by 13 state and federal agencies, and it's typically received within 75 days from when your application is accepted, and it's valid for 3 years. So Rachel has discussed this, and I hope we're definitely have proved to you all that, unlike bulkheads, which often require costly repairs or replacement, especially after storms, living shorelines, they require little to no maintenance, and the salt marsh is typically restored within 1 to 3 years. After Hurricane Florence, we assessed numerous shorelines, living shorelines in North Carolina to see how they fared after the storm, and the salt marsh plants, the rock sills, the oyster bags, they weren't affected by the storms. And these bags also remain in place and were not damaged. So in order to implement our living shoreline projects, we've been very fortunate to receive funding for living shorelines from various state and federal grants, regional partnerships, as well as private funds. So I just want to highlight a few of these, in particular grants from NOAA and the state's Community Conservation Assistance Program, as well as the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, they've provided Living Shoreline cost share programs as an incentive for waterfront property owners to install Living Shorelines, where the landowner pays a portion of the project and the grant pays the other portion. So these cost share opportunities have been extremely valuable to increase the use of Living Shorelines in the state. And this is just some more information on the Community Conservation Assistance Program. This grant covers 75% of the cost of your living shoreline up to a cap of $5,000. And the applications for these grants usually open up sometime in the fall. And you're welcome to contact the Coastal Federation or the local Soil and Water Conservation District representative. In Carteret County, it's Todd Kelly, and in Onslow County, it's Candace Jarman. But each of the 20 coastal counties of the state has their own representative. So if you're interested in installing a living shoreline and obtaining funding assistance, contact me at the Coastal Federation, and I'll place you on your list, and we'll work with you as soon as possible. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Margaret. Oh, hang on one second. Yes, absolutely. We have seen, you know, the Coastal Federation ourselves and partnering with restoration systems, we've definitely seen an increase. And one of the things that we want to do is take statistics of that. So we're working on that to kind of have some numbers on how they have increased. But definitely it's been a lot easier to get these permits. Great question. Oh, there's one more slide. There's one more slide. Oh, yes. So, yes, so there's some additional resources that are here. There's a Living Shoreline fact sheet, as well as a contractor list of contractors that work here in North Carolina. And then, of course, the Living Shorelines Academy is a great resource. It has some online training at different levels, both for homeowner scales as far as contractor scales, with more resources as well. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Mary Margaret. Get her presentation up here in a minute. All right, take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Alexia. We'll see if I can figure this out and make it work. We're loaded on. So, hey Alexia, how can I move this? Oh, got it. Never mind. Sorry, technical difficulties were squared away. So, thank you, Alexia, and good morning, everyone out there today. I'm going to be talking to you about permitting and constructing the most common type of living shorelines for homeowners in this area, which is an oyster shell bag living shoreline. So my name, as Alexia said, is Mary Margaret McKinney. I'm Director of Coastal Restoration for Restoration Systems, LLC in Raleigh. For the last 20 years, I was president of Carolina Silvics, a natural resources contracting firm located in Edenton. And earlier this year, my staff and I joined with Restoration Systems, a national leader in environmental mitigation. And we're now pleased to introduce RS Shorelines, a company devoted exclusively to this environmentally superior way of protecting our coastline. So both Restoration Systems and Carolina Silvics have a long history of collaboration with the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and RS Shorelines will continue to build on this legacy. In 2016, we began working with the Coastal Federation to permit and install living shorelines in Carteret and Onslow counties. And to date, we have installed over 49,000 bags of shells. At the end of 2020, just with the current properties we already have contracted, we will have stabilized over 1 mile of North Carolina coastline with oyster shell bag living shorelines. So as a homeowner at this point, you may be asking, so how do I transform my shoreline from this to this? And that's where RS Shorelines is here to help. We have developed a streamlined 5-step process that can have a living shoreline in place and functioning on your property in just a matter of weeks. That process is identify, assess, contract, permit, and install. And I'm going to briefly walk you through each of these steps now. So the first thing we do is to identify a site. Sites can be identified in a variety of different ways. A landowner may hear about the living shorelines at an event like this from the media, by word of mouth, from, they may contact the Coastal Federation directly, or they may contact RS directly. Federation staff or RS may observe the property while working on another site and reach out to the landowner. A neighbor or a friend might refer us to a property and give the owner's contact information. Or we may identify a property as a potential site through a mapping analysis of county land records or aerial photographs, other GIS photography. After a site is identified, then we enter the assessment stage. We have a consultation with the landowner and talk about the history of the shoreline, the erosion that's been occurring, past methods that may have been used to stabilize the shoreline, if any, the landowner's concerns and desires, and what they hope to gain out of their shoreline. For instance, a living shoreline doesn't have to restrict your access to the water. Let's say you'd like to keep a place to launch a kayak or simply enter the water. We can install a small break in the shoreline that we'll put a baffle in front of it, and that will fully protect your shoreline while also still providing easy water access. We need to know that sort of thing up front, so the consultation is a great time to discuss that. We then arrange a site visit to see the property for ourselves and determine if the property is suitable for a shell bag living shoreline. Sometimes that site visit will be just with an RS staff member, such as Granger Caultry, who's here with us today and you'll hear from later. Sometimes we include Alexia or another Coastal Federation staff member. If the site is complex, we may go ahead and ask the representative from the NC Division of Coastal Management to meet us out there. Of course, all with the landowner's approval first. The first thing we determine during the site visit, oops, I went the wrong way. Now I can't get rid of my chat box. Sorry, technical difficulties. Sorry. The first thing we asked when we got to the site visit is the site suitable? And suitable properties are coastal properties on a creek, a river, or a sound that typically experience low to moderate wave energies. It's important to note that oysters do not need to already be present in the area for a living shoreline to be suitable. If there are natural oyster larvae in the water, then those larvae will attach to your new oyster shoreline and grow quickly. And depending on local water quality, they can even be eaten. But even if there are no natural oyster larvae present, a shellbag shoreline will still protect your property and increase the biodiversity of your shoreline by creating new habitats. So we also have to determine what sort of shellbag structure is most appropriate for the site, and many sites will use a combination of structures. As Alexia was discussing earlier, if your property has a steeply eroded shoreline with active erosion that is occurring and or moderate wave energies, then that property, or maybe a portion of the property, may be most suited to a revetment. As she and Rachel talked about, a revetment is when the bags are placed directly against the existing shoreline. This stabilizes the existing shoreline and prevents further erosion and loss of marsh. I did it again. Sorry, I'm just using the clicker and not a mouse. This stabilizes the existing shoreline and prevents further erosion and loss of marsh. This type of shoreline can take higher wave energies than the second type of shoreline structure, which is an offshore sill. For properties or portions of properties with less severely eroded shorelines or lower wave energies, an offshore sill is often most appropriate. Sills are placed 5 to 30 feet off of the existing shoreline and don't extend more than 6 inches above the mean high water line. As such, the sill is typically underwater at high tide and above water at low tide. And with the sill, the wave will hit the structure and at high tide roll over it, losing energy in the process. Sediment and sand will fall out of the water column as it passes over the sill and build up behind it. And in this way, you can actually reclaim marsh that you've previously lost to erosion or grow new marsh. If your site has higher wave energy than the shell bags alone can withstand without shifting in place, we do have another option without having to go to the rock, which is to place the shells into a gabion. Gabions are mesh baskets that the bag shells are placed into. These gabions can be used as a revetment or a sill, and then we place additional bags in front or behind as needed to provide additional support and to create a more gentle slope to the structure. And again, one individual property may use one of these methods or all of these methods. So once we visited your property and determined that it is suitable for an oyster shell bag living shoreline, we enter the contract phase. We determine a cost estimate based on the linear feet of each type of shoreline and therefore how many bags that we are going to need. We then prepare a proposal and forward that to the North Carolina Coastal Federation. They review our proposed design and cost estimate and determine if they have cost share available to assist with the project. If so, then they will send that contract along to the landowner, detailing the estimated price and providing payment terms and any other stipulations that may be required to receive that cost share payment. The next step in the process is permitting, and we apply for and receive your permit. That's all completely taken care of us as part of your contract, including the permitting fee. So you don't have to worry about keeping up with the different parts or who you need to contact. Alexia reviewed the permit types a few minutes ago, but most, as she said, most homeowner projects will require one of the two coastal area management general permits. The first step in the process is to have several different landowner forms completed. The first is an agent authorization that gives us and the Coastal Federation the right to communicate with the Division of Coastal Management on your behalf for this specific project only. The next are adjacent landowner waivers that are either hand-delivered or mailed via certified mail to your adjoining waterfront neighbors. On the waiver, we'll let your neighbors know about the Living Shoreline project you have proposed, ask them if they have any objections to it, and if they would be willing to waive the 15-foot setback from their property line so that you can extend your living shoreline all the way to your property line. Almost all neighbors waive the setback. Once we have received these forms back from you and your neighbors, we submit them, drawings, and photographs of your proposed project, along with the permitting fee, to the Division of Coastal Management. Once they receive it, they perform a site visit and then call us to discuss the project. Sorry, I went too far again. They talk to us, they would go over the project, any permit conditions they might have, and we typically have that permit back in hand within 2 weeks of submitting your application. So it really is a relatively quick process. So once we have your permit in hand, all there's left to do is install your shoreline. Granger, who is most likely who performed your site visit, is also going to be in charge of your installation, and he really tries to keep our project rolling right along. So we can typically begin an installation within a week or 10 days of receiving your permit, weather and tides permitting, of course. Many installations are very tide specific, so there may be a brief delay if there are not good tide windows immediately available. We perform the installation with a small crew and a minor amount of equipment that is geared specifically towards having the least impact on your property. And installations for most projects take less than a week. So that's our 5-step process to have a living shoreline installed on your property easily and quickly. I would invite you to visit our website, rshorelines.com, to learn more about living shoreline. We have additional information on the benefits. We have a brief annotated bibliography of scientific papers supporting those benefits, the photo gallery of some of our completed projects, and a frequently asked questions page. We also have a quote request form where you can reach out to us directly to inquire about installing a living shoreline on your property. And with that, we now have plenty of time set aside for questions. This is my contact information. You can also reach out to anyone else. And Alexia and Rachel are going to rearrange us all so we can do a little social distanced open house questioning.